Welcome to Random History. This series is basically just going to be, random moments and random videos on history and just random moments in time. History, I think, is an amalgamation of everything else, is just a blink of an eye. So this is basically just, an homage and honor to a whole bunch of, well-known periods of time and not so well-known periods of time, and I just want to cover some of it. And this series is going to be a little bit different. It's just going to be more of a discussion, just more of a talk, and a little bit of just a bit of a timeline, but for the most part, just a real broad discussion on certain periods. And the first one I would like to do is basically on probably the only lasting revolution, the American Revolution. So if you guys like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Hope you guys enjoy. Let's talk about it. What is the American Revolution? I think that really depends on really who you talk to. There's just the more general history of it all, where it's basically just, the period between, some would say 1765 to basically 1783, when we actually fought a war for our independence, known as the Revolutionary War, which is going to be a separate episode that I plan to do, because that in itself, the actual conflict is deeply fascinating and really deserves its own attention specifically. But there's that school of thought where it's just this general 20-year period where basically just things start happening. It's the escalation of tactics from both Great Britain and these rough-rousing patriot colonists, for the most part. They're just going against British rule, and at least in the patriots' minds, the aggressiveness of British tyranny, etc., etc. So there's that one school of thought, and for me, it's much more broader than that, I think. I think, in a lot of ways, the American Revolution was something that was always going to happen in one way, shape, or form. I think it was always going to happen once the Enlightenment really started. So, my interpretation of the American Revolution in a lot of ways really goes back, hundreds of years, which is why I wanted to bring up this as one of the first topics, because I think this really goes back hundreds of years, and I mean hundreds of years. I don't think you can talk about the American Revolution without talking about some of the British conflicts and trying to colonize America in a lot of ways. Their conflicts with the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and them winning successive battles, etc., left and right. And them really, going down that path where, the conflicts within the Americas itself ultimately leads to conflicts with especially their biggest enemy, the French, and their baguettes and whatnot, but for the most part just fighting successive wars over and over and over again, and ultimately leading to the many things that were going to occur. I think it's 200 years of a multivariate analysis of a whole bunch of different things happening. It's this idea of freedom, liberty, the Lockean ideals. Like, a lot of these ideals came from the Enlightenment period of, life, liberty, and property. The basically America being away from England and not having a king directly there in front of them, and having, clear oversight from, I guess you could say, British lords and whatnot, that wasn't aggressive, at least in the early goings, until, a lot of the British, or a lot of the, specifically the Massachusetts young rabbles from the Boston area really, wreaking havoc on things, I guess you could say, for the most part. But, and, it just takes a lot of, and look, I love the Founding Fathers, but really, big-headed, aristocratic and rich people, ultimately learning and really trying to believe in these functional and fundamental ideals that John Locke espoused, and effectively a financial crisis that would go along with it, that would really be the final match to really light the fuse of a whole bunch of different things, as everything culminated into what would be the American Revolution. The American Revolution is probably the single most important revolution in history, and it's not just because I'm an American, but I think most modern countries today can really look towards that. I mean, this really started a whole bunch of different things. We were seen as this big success story that many countries have attempted to imitate. The most famous being the French Revolution. Most of the writings basically come from the writings of Thomas Jefferson. And basically his Declaration of Independence, which would be the framework for the France's declarations of the rights of man, etc., etc. A whole bunch of different things like that. And don't get me wrong, most of those would fail, mainly because of history and just the reaction of it, where autocracies and monarchies trying to hold power within the middle of the 19th century, I guess you could say. Just the clamp down on it ultimately, and in fact most of the monarchies rising alongside this little constitutional republic that came out, known as the United States of America. In a lot of ways, it's the great experiment, and it's still a bit of an experiment today. And ultimately, we're still trying to figure out the pros and the cons of this American Revolution that ultimately occurred. There's a lot of cons, obviously, but people always tend to overlook the pros too. And this episode is going to be really delving deep into it. So let's start the discussion. Before we get into the specific origins of, just the general ideas of the American Revolution, you should probably talk about, I think if you want to understand history, you want to understand politics, you want to understand how this country really started its formation, then I think people need to understand, at least to an extent, Great Britain, and at the very least, even I'm going to give you a bit of a dumbed down, very overly simplified, probably even wrong interpretation, to be quite honest with you, of Great Britain. So do correct me if I'm wrong and do your own research. But for the most part, Great Britain is a monarchy. I think today it would be considered technically a constitutional monarchy. I don't think they have a specific constitution. There's a whole bunch of different countries that have a whole bunch of different constitutions, but they really don't follow it. America's one of the few countries that is specifically a constitutional republic and specifically follows those republican principles. But for the most part, functionally, Great Britain is a monarchy. It's an autocracy. It's led by one rule and one hereditary line, which means that, and it sounds pretty simple, but, people don't think about it sometimes, where, just because you may be this powerful country, you live and die by a king or queen. You live and die by your rulers. And Great Britain just so happened to have a long line of successive rulers, but there's a whole bunch of different things about Great Britain that we don't think about. For instance, even back in the 17th century, they had a prime minister, they had a parliament to a certain extent, and they had them running the day-to-day operations, although the king had and the monarchy had all absolute power for the most part. And it's just fascinating because I'm looking at specific points in history, and I'm looking at the early goings at the very least for British colonization of the United States isn't very prominent. Spain ends up taking a lot of land, a lot of territory, and France makes their moves for the most part, and Great Britain's kind of faltering in certain aspects, and you have to wonder why specifically they're faltering in certain aspects. And it goes to what I come to find is it's known as the English Interregnum, I guess you could say. I am probably pronouncing it right. Interregnum. It's known as the time between kings. Yes, there was an actual brief period of time where an actual English civil war occurred between the king and the parliament, or I guess you could say the people for the most part, for rule over the country. Charles I was the king, and he had a very fascinating rule in particular. Many people would probably point to him as a destructive monarch, a terrible monarch, and a monster in a lot of ways, usurping a lot of the rule and a lot of the things, and I guess you could say the checks and balances with Parliament, who basically was losing power and losing steam. A lot of it had to do with his wife, too, who I believe was Catholic. Politics and religion, am I right, people? But I believe Great Britain was Protestant back then, and a lot of people in the Parliament, with her being an open Catholic, basically, just irked a lot of people. The lady was the French Catholic princess Henrietta Marie, and she was just not a well-liked person also to begin with. But for the most part, Charles I, in the beginnings of conflict within his own parliament, would basically suspend Parliament early in 1629 for the next decade or so, in which case he ruled with just an iron fist, doing what he pleased, with people slowly growing disenfranchised, angry, frustrated, to a point where a civil war would begin, an outbreak of the civil war would begin that would last for the better part of a decade, from 1642 to 1649. The king, his royalist supporters, against a brave man and the leader of the parliamentary forces in the parliament itself, a young man named Oliver Cromwell. The fighting would ensue for years. But the truth is populism always tends to win out. People always tend to win out. And, great rules and great leaders tend to lose out as if they lose the people for the most part. And he lost the people. Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentary forces were able to win and gain the upper hand. Charles I would be beheaded and after being tried for treason and whatnot, in which case the monarchy would end in the parliamentary republic, I guess you could say. In a lot of ways, one of the first republics is going to be created in England specifically. The English Commonwealth, it would be known. You have to understand there have been many attempts in the republics, even during the time of the United States when they were trying to figure out their constitution, what direction the country was going to go in. The Dutch had their own republic, and several other countries had their own republic. But this was a very pivotal moment in time where Great Britain was going to try its luck at a republic. The leader of this republic would be the man who led this parliamentary force, Oliver Cromwell himself. He was a pretty popular man. I mean, they always are popular at first, but, power can corrupt. And power can corrupt in ways if it's unchecked. And, if the person doesn't have the right mood, the right mentality of going into it. And it's very difficult for a lot of these people, which is also the reason why I hold George Washington in such high regard, because he understood that people are capable of a lot of these incredible things in terms of corruption. You know how it goes sometimes. Cromwell himself enjoyed, a surprising level of popularity. But then people started seeing he's starting to act like a king. But he's not a king. He's not, the son of God in a lot of ways, or, chosen by God, etc., etc. He's just a man. He's just a man and nothing more. And when he died, the next person to take over wouldn't be the next in line in the parliament. It wouldn't even be, an election or voting. No, it would be his son. His son, Richard Cromwell. And the problem with Richard Cromwell is he was unprepared for the reality that was going to take in order to lead an English Commonwealth and lead a people and lead a direction for a country. Within 2 years of his rule, Great Britain basically had beyond enough, and one of the surviving sons of Charles I, Charles II, would be put back onto the throne to resume the English monarchy. The return of Charles II is known as this period of restoration. Charles II wasted no time, basically laying his dick on the table for the most part, if I'm going to be quite honest with you, and ultimately ends up becoming one of the most underratedly influential figures in the rising British Empire, I guess you could say, during this period of time, during his period in rule. A lot of different acts, a lot of different taxes, a lot of different legislation is going to come through because of him. He basically begins expanding the British Empire, monetarily speaking, financially speaking. Cromwell had actually attempted to do so, but failed in many aspects, in many ways. And ultimately, because of Charles II's I guess you could say purposeful, I don't even know how to quite explain it. He just went balls deep, is probably the best way I could explain it, into trying to make as much money for Great Britain and the world as possible. Money was everything, and basically for Charles II, he did everything he could. He basically started what is known as the restoration colonies and proprietary colonies for the most part, in which he was going to win back or really begin and start up a whole bunch of different colonial projects, specifically in obviously North America, notably the Carolinas. He would take back Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. I actually take that back. I think Pennsylvania was already under British rule, but he actually ends up giving a lot of those territories to specific people. William Pitt, or the Duke of York, for the most part. That's ultimately going to end up being named. A whole bunch of these different individuals ultimately. Whole point functionally being that, the aggressive economic expansion, the idea of, people going to just say South Carolina to heavily plant tobacco left and right and, wear out the soil ultimately, but ultimately to plant for the British and ultimately to profit for the British. The East Indian Trading Company can succeed as an organization, and ultimately Great Britain can succeed as a country. Charles II really started something that his brother, King James II, he would take the throne in 1685 after the death of his brother. Ultimately, he would continue a lot of the expansion, I guess you could say, policies, including a whole bunch of different cultural and religious revolutions that would occur in, the Plymouth territory, a lot of the territories in the Northeast in particular, Massachusetts, etc. I'll get into that, and then probably another quick episode. That will probably be a quick hitter, random history episode. But for the most part, a lot of the things that James is going to do is really centralize the government. He's going to be the person that's going to create, in a lot of ways, actually, technically speaking, the first real constitutional monarchy, basically creating a lot of different things, a Bill of Rights, a parliament's independence from the monarchy, protection of the parliament and certain citizens and their particular rights against the king, the right to petition the king, a whole bunch of different things, habeas corpus, and it also coincides with the ideas of a certain individual named John Locke. John Locke was a doctor. He was an educator. He was an exile in Holland during the reign of King James II. And he actually came back to England, though, for a brief time, published a whole bunch of different books. One of his is 2 treaties of government, arguing that the government was a form of contract between the leaders and the people, and that the representative government existed to protect, in his famous quote of all time, life, liberty, and property. John Locke himself espoused the ideas, rejecting the divine rights of kings, and advocated for the central role of a parliament with limited monarchy. But before we even get into the Enlightenment itself, I just want to point out that, before everything happens, the whole reason why people want to come to the country, and people, or I guess you could say, the New World in a lot of ways, is because many things are occurring with great financial prominence and I guess you could say lucrative financial dealings for the most part. It also comes with a whole bunch of different things. Ideas are one thing, but when you have a lot of money and you are financially capable, you can really influence a bunch of different things. Notably, this consumer revolution, this agricultural revolution that's going to take place. I mean, people can just come to the United States, purchase a whole bunch of different slaves, which ultimately is a big reason why the slave trade becomes so big, is because of the need for this eventual consumer revolution in a lot of ways. And let's just be honest here. A lot of the colonists really didn't care, but at the same time, Great Britain's not helping themselves either, kind of pushing slaves and indentured servitude on in a lot of ways for a lot of these people. They needed labor, they needed their tobacco, you know what I'm saying? But at the same time, a consumer revolution was occurring too. A whole bunch of different people were able to make a lot of money off of this. And a lot of people had capabilities to really just do whatever they wanted to. And this developed a fascinating aristocratic class, and specifically in Virginia and in the Carolinas, where this became most prominent, where a lot of people had a lot of time for themselves. They're able to basically purchase, consume goods, all this stuff, and do what they wanted to do in a lot of ways because they were financially capable. For a lot of people in the colonies, they weren't taxed all that much in relative comparison, especially the rich. The rich were very well off, and they had a lot of time on their hands. A lot of them going into politics, debating ideas and things for themselves, which is going to lead into the next topic I'm going to talk about. But, men like Thomas Jefferson are going to come up because they have the financial liquid to really do a lot of these things. Understand, pamphlets are being printed out. People are able to read. There's actual sustainability in life. People aren't freaking out about, I guess you could say, what their next meal is for the day. When they're going to get their next source of water. They're not thinking about, how am I going to live on a day-to-day basis? How am I going to take care of my family? How am I going to get in with this particular group of people? Because you see, it allowed, technically speaking, a lot of ordinary and normal people to really have an opportunity, I think, in a lot of ways, to really think for themselves. And that sounds very strange to say, and I'm not saying that they didn't think for themselves, but to actually read, study, look at several different ideas, and come to many different conclusions that a lot of these people ultimately will come to. Two great movements really came out of this during this period of time. The first would be the Great Awakening. First and foremost, the Great Awakening specifically is, I guess you could say, a vigorous love of religion, and specifically almost evangelical religion in a lot of ways. But that's more so for the Second Great Awakening in particular. But ultimately, this Great Awakening was just basically religious fervor that would almost in a lot of ways create a lot of the contentious religious issues that the country is going to occur and have for the next basically century or so, that men like Thomas Jefferson is going to be basically arguing for religious freedom, etc., which are the great purposes specifically for a lot of the things that Thomas Jefferson espoused. If you don't like Jefferson, that's your own issues, but for the most part, there were serious problems that came up with this Great Awakening initially. But the most important aspect, and I think without a single moment of hesitation in my personal perspective and point of view, was known as the Enlightenment, or as a lot of people might refer to it, the Age of Reason. Some of you are probably wondering what the Enlightenment was specifically. It's this, the best way I could explain it is a cultural and intellectual pursuit and movement that started occurring aggressively so within the 18th century, and basically was a push not necessarily against religion, but to take a step back and look at things in a more reasonable or rational perspective and point of view. Let's look at logic over superstition and blind faith within religion, and a lot of people, along with this, industrial revolution that's going to be coming up, and then a lot of people with the consumer revolution able to consume books at a higher rate than basically Thomas Jefferson's going to have a field day. For the most part, books were very hard to come by, but now they're being more plentiful, and people can actually purchase and read several different books, and, many people, these great enlightenment thinkers, Locke, people who are going to push for science instead of, I guess you could say, religious beliefs and fervent faith, like Isaac Newton and Voltaire, questioned what we know as knowledge and spread out ideas of openness, investigation, and religious tolerance, basically throughout Europe, and especially and aggressively so within the Americas. A lot of people say that the Age of Enlightenment really, took us out of the Dark Ages. We went from the Dark Ages to the Age of Light when the Age of Enlightenment came. And a lot of these things really went into the whole political sphere as well. One history book that I read, I think really puts the ideas that dominated the Enlightenment period perfectly into perspective. There's a whole bunch of different things: rationalism, empiricism, and progressivism. Even some point out cosmopolitanism. Rationalism obviously is pretty simple, but to explain it there would be to use, or to explain it in this case would be to use their own personal reasoning to gain knowledge. Real popular sovereignty and liberty in a lot of ways. Just basically, I'm my own man and I'm my own individual, And I don't really need God or scripture for guidance, but a lot of people have differing perspectives and points of view on that today, to be quite honest with you. Then you have empiricism, the idea that what you empirically can see in the world, what you can observe and what you experience is ultimately going to be more fruitful than anything else ultimately, and that's how you're going to learn the best. Progressivism, not progressivism as we see it today, to be quite honest, but the idea that with our ability to reason, to observe, to empirically look at things from a rational perspective, we can make progress, true human progress over time. And we can basically, in a lot of ways, go away from the carnage that war ultimately ends up bringing with logic and reality. And in cosmopolitanism, in the history book, points out, I think, something really fascinating. It's basically taking an actual real step back and looking at the world, looking at yourself as a citizen of the world and how you actively engage in it within the world, instead of being a very closed-minded individual. It's just really broadening your perspective overall for the most part. We are ruled by reasoning and not by prejudice and not by anything else in particular. Now, there's going to be a whole bunch of different issues that go along with it, especially with, this age of enlightenment and, free your mind and stuff like that. And there's going to be a lot of race issues. Let's just be honest there about it. But at least the functional characteristics and ideas that they are espousing and they are thinking about really stem from this age of enlightenment that really begins the American Revolution. And it's the very first steps in beginning the American Revolution. The application of the Enlightenment period really begins in the late 17th and early 18th century. And it's really pushed by specific, well-known group of people. The Freemasons, the Freemasons were this weird fraternal society, and there's a whole bunch of backstories that go along with it. But for the most part, at the very least in the early goings, absolutely, they push this idea of inquiry, tolerance, and start off as basically just a couple of young Whig men going into coffee houses, going into taverns to talk about it, and debates, and really to embody this idea of rationality, etc. And it's funny too, because a lot of people, I think, I think a lot of these people some felt they only did these things because they were a bit narcissistic, and that's kind of fair. And especially when you read about some of the things with the founding fathers, you tend to understand why a lot of people really don't like the founding fathers. And I have my problems with them too, although their ideas, I think, are functionally very sound. But, men started really becoming prominent within the colonies themselves. And one particular man that, we hold in such high esteem is a man named Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's obviously going to be one of the most well-known founding fathers, fascinating individuals who's going to really grossly influence his country, both as an individual person, one who basically does all the things he can for society. He works as a printer, and really ends up working because he first works for the Pennsylvania Gazette and begins his own annual publication, and basically writing just a whole bunch of different books, Poor Richard and Almanac, and really starts showing off a lot of his ideas. He's a deist, but I think a deist back then was just more that we had God, but, he created this world, but he's left it to us for our own machinations, and what we do with it ultimately is going to be up to us for the most part. And, and because of that, we have our own moral compass. We have our own belief in that, if we're going to succeed not only as a people, to do all the things that he taught us and gave to us, that we need to be our best and do our best and be as strict as we can and do good work and be good, honorable, fidelity in a lot of ways, and just be as good-hearted as you possibly can be. And even then, he continued to espouse a lot of the ideas that he was espousing. Once he retired, he would basically work in science, politics, and into political theory. And, his own rational behavior started to change because he was a very pro-British individual, pro-monarchy. His son would be pro-British and pro-monarchy. I think his only surviving son, technically, who would actually be very pro-British and pro-monarchy during the actual revolution itself. And ultimately ends up getting captured, I believe, during the war itself. And they would never reconcile again, but that's a completely different story for Benjamin Franklin entirely. But for the most part, the ideas that he espouses, an important individual, an important person, cannot be overstated. He is the example of a man who is going to help grossly influence what would be the next generation of, colonists, the generation that will become the Founding Fathers. We've talked about some of the history. We've talked about some of the laws, the regulations, the people that would influence basically a lot of the people coming to America to begin with. And we've talked about slavery to a very, very, very brief extent, but a lot of the personal rights, etc., etc. And should probably talk about the natives too, but they're going to have their own point within this story as well. But ultimately, in terms of the idea of an American Revolution, they can be considered along with the British, technically speaking, in terms of how the British influenced them. I should talk about, and then we talk about the Age of Enlightenment, the people who influenced the Founding Fathers in the Age of Enlightenment, but we should talk about probably the biggest issue that will lead to this American Revolution, ultimately speaking. The biggest reason is ultimately, in a lot of ways, the baguette people, the French individuals, France. You see, in the new world, in America, it's always about territory. In fact, a little tidbit, Georgia, the state itself, is actually named after King George II, I believe. They actually ended up taking that territory and creating it because they wanted a buffer between their two, one of the more important colonies in the North and South Carolina, and as a buffer between them and Florida. And Georgia's going to actually be the one state that doesn't bring anyone to the First Continental Congress because they have still a very loyalist governor in particular. And you have to understand, everything is about territory, everything is about land, everything's about power in a lot of ways. And the more power you have, the more, you're going to be a bit of a world power. And the only power that was going to combat Great Britain was going to really, at this point, be France. And now you see Great Britain and France would fight a lot. And I mean, it becomes a bit of a routine for a lot of the colonists, where they end up fighting during the summer and then return to the quarters, return home for the winters, and a lot of these issues and a lot of these battles would end up occurring over the better part of a century, from the late 17th century all the way up until the French and Indian War. In fact, when I talked about Washington, and I talked about some of the battles specifically, a lot of World War battles kind of occur in a lot of ways in America. Great Britain and France basically have a whole bunch of different allies with, Spain. Like at one point in the Queen Anne's War of 1702 to 1713. Great Britain's going to fight Spain and France, because Spain would actually have a new ruler who would ascend to the throne, the Habsburgs, I believe, and ultimately a lot of fighting is going to take place in Florida, New England, New France, and Canada, and they would basically just give up in the winter and just call it a day before more fighting would continue. There's going to be war after war after war after war, ultimately, so that just keeps rising in tensions and rising specifically in a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, in specifically that Queen Anne's War, the United States is going to be very much involved in a lot of these conflicts. The American settlers are going to be very much involved in a lot of these conflicts. One of the most well-known conflicts during this specific war itself, in Queen Anne's War in particular, for instance, is the Indian raid against Deerfield, Massachusetts. A small French force with a native force made up of Mohawks, Abenaki, or the I can't pronounce it because I'm a terrible reader of native pronunciation, attacking a whole bunch of different frontier outposts, one in particular, Deerfield, killing about 112 people, captives, and a whole bunch of ministers, I guess you could say, and effectively ended up, creating a bit of a contentious and fascinating, I guess you could say, scandal in a lot of ways. I think one of the minister's daughters ended up marrying a Mohawk and did not want to go back home to New England. But there's a whole bunch of different wars that really entail this entire point in time. Conflict after conflict that, war, you should become accustomed to battle. You could become accustomed to fighting. And ultimately, you kind of understand what fighting means, understand what fighting is going to happen to you. In fact, most of the people that will participate, not most, but a lot of the people that will participate within the Revolutionary War were former veterans of the French and Indian War themselves, who are going to help participate and fight against British tyranny, War after war after war, whether it's the war of Jenkins' Ear, King George's War, which could be in Europe I think it was known as the Austrian War, it would all culminate into many more conflicts that it's fascinating that they even had time to fight. War that would span basically 3 or 4 British kings, all the way up until the French and Indian War, the final Imperial War, which again was just another war of just, hey, you stepped on my land, I know I didn't step on your land, you totally did step on my land, and I'm going to send George Washington over there to basically make sure you didn't do anything finicky. And George Washington's like, hey guys, oh whoops, I just started an international conflict. War was always going to happen, to be quite honest with you. And this French and Indian War in particular was a conflict that was growing for the past 20 years after probably a very surprising a time of peace, I guess one could say. But war was going to basically just occur. And the French and Indian War, I think, deserves its own episode, because whenever I get around to it, I'm going to talk about it more in depth, along specifically with the war, basically the 7 Years' War in its entirety. But once this war happens, the French and Indian War happens, basically you can all but guarantee the American Revolution was going to occur. Long story short, though, France would lose. They would lose this grand world conflict in a very deeply expensive war for both France and Great Britain. France is going to be slightly better, if I'm going to be quite honest, but not much by any stretch of the imagination, which is why when they basically get themselves within the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence itself, they basically crippled their own economy in a lot of ways, which leads to the French Revolution. Anyways, though, Great Britain, they are broke. They may have conquered the world, and they may be the ultimate superpower with basically the greatest army in the world, and they are broke. They are in debt, and they really have no functional way to pay it off. But for the most part, they have an idea. They have a potential cash cow revenue, which has always been their big cash cow revenue, and that's the colonists, the United States, the the people who will become the patriots, and a lot of these individuals have never really paid direct or at least excessively indirect taxes. In particular, direct taxes being I'm going to directly tax you for this, and indirect taxes tend to be much more akin to business related issues and business related finances. I'm going to buy this and I'm going to tax you on that. It's a little more complicated, but it was more so specifically for, if I sell this for that, then it's going to cost me a little bit extra in order to actually export this specific good, which was much more of the economy back then, when most of the society by this point in time is very agrarian by every stretch of the imagination. For them, there's potentially speaking more opportunity within the West, past the Appalachian Mountains. You had just won a big conflict within the war itself. Eventually, you will be able to get the Northwest Territory, which includes states like Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, yada yada. A lot of those states, or eventual states in particular, and for a lot of these colonists, for them to move out west was a great opportunity for them. They can just settle land, bring all that stuff back down to whatever river they can find, or on horseback, although it's not very financially smart or lucrative. It was a great opportunity, but the unfortunate reality is that the French had the aid of the natives, and the natives were not very happy about what was going on. One notable native, I believe he was a chief, or one native warrior, Chief Pontiac, would basically unite a whole bunch of different Indian villages, which would be known as Pontiac's Rebellion, to basically combat the British Army and the colonists, which would create a whole bunch of different issues and problems, notably with the creation of what would be known as the specific frontiersmen that would attack a whole bunch of, I guess you could say, very innocent Native Americans, the Conestoga natives, the Paxton Boys, who would brutalize a whole bunch of different natives in response to Pontiac and a whole bunch of other natives, brutally killing, white settlers in respective ways. The fighting between these two groups, the white settlers and the natives, it's fucking brutal. It's really tragic, but ultimately this ends up creating a lot of issues between the two. The British government trying to stop bloodshed from occurring. They try and create this proclamation line, which really stops westward expansion, which pisses off a lot of people, both on the British side especially, but especially on the American side. How dare you stop us? What are you doing? We will fight these Indians. We will do the beginnings of what would be manifest destiny. What are you doing? And for the British, things are not looking good. It's by 1763, equivalently, their national debts doubled for the most part. The equivalent of about, back then it was about, $130 million in national debt, which I think today is probably closer to, high billion, I would probably say. Somewhere around there, but my math was probably off. But for the most part, they actively decided they're going to do several different things, specifically, raising taxes, reforms. There's a whole bunch of things in their back pocket that they can absolutely do. One of these reforms in particular was the currency reform, the Currency Act of 1764. That would be one of the first big indicators of things to come, specifically. The colonists relied on paper money. There wasn't really specifically any specific dollar. In fact, some of the colonies actually had their own currency, but gold and silver were generally in short supply, and it didn't help that they tried to pass the Sugar Act of 1764. It actually made things cheaper for the British, but ultimately ended up making things a little bit more expensive, although in a lot of ways it would help streamline a lot of what the sugar, or I guess you could say molasses back then, ultimately was going to cost the colonists. The problem, though, is that they basically created a bit of a fascinating monarchy in the way that they had actually legislated it specifically. It enforced the provisions prior to the Sugar Act of 1764. If colonists had violated any of the previous acts, they would have been tried in specifically local courts. And colonial juries obviously would have been like, hey, that's my neighbor Jeff. What are you doing with Jeff? But the Sugar Act specifically forced crown-sanctioned tribunals, actual trial by not a jury of your peers. For the most part, you can see a lot of the things and a lot of our constitutional amendments that are occurring over this particular period of time that are starting to make things very clear. And a lot of these colonists and a lot of these Englishmen are basically saying that trial by jury had been long honored as a basic right of Englishmen under the British Constitution. And this is where things really start turning. Colonists in America loved the Constitution. They loved the British Constitution, and actually gave them a genuine freedom in a lot of these things that they had that were supposed to help specifically create this, the very bare bones idea of a checks and balances system that ultimately they felt was kind of just going downhill, at least for them specifically in the United States, or the colonies, I guess you could say, at this particular point in time. This is where things start going south. This is where things start really turning, and an indirect, and don't get me wrong, the Sugar Act and sugar tax was an indirect tax specifically, but for them, it felt like a bit of a violation in a lot of ways. Say what you will about the things that are happening today, but there is credence, historically speaking, for a lot of these things that are occurring. Historically speaking, I mean, because you see, it isn't just because you have to understand, these people were British, by every sense of the imagination. They still saw themselves as faithful British servants. In fact, many of these people would still, even in 1765, feel as though they are still a part of, the British, monarchy in a lot of ways. Benjamin Franklin among these people, and a lot of these people did not have apprehensive feelings towards Great Britain. George Washington, Jefferson, Adams, some of the most prominent figures of their time and era. Adams, surprisingly so, since he is such an advocate for republicanism, and a lot of his ideas in a lot of ways go against the grain of what Great Britain is slowly and potentially turning into. And if the Sugar Act was one thing that made them feel less British, then the Stamp Act, personally was just a knife in the heart to what a lot of these people functionally believed and what it meant to be British, and really questioning their British spirits and their British identity. The British Parliament in 1765 moved beyond the efforts during their previous 2 years fighting with the whole Sugar Act, the westward expansion, and just decided, we're just going to just tax you directly, because they absolutely needed the money. They needed the liquid as soon as possible, with the Stamp Act of 1765, a direct tax on the colonists, imposing an internal tax on almost every type of printed paper the colonists used. Newspaper, playing cards, any legal document that they had. You could probably just write your name, and it's like tax. And the truth is that I think, this is an instance, unfortunately, where I think they ultimately ended up not really thinking things through before they ultimately ended up going down this path, ultimately. So, but for the most part, it ended up giving rise to one of the greatest slogans of all time: no taxation without representation. The Stamp Act being reinforced to some colonists, even though they had no representation within the British Parliament themselves, so that they could at the very least have a voice within the Parliament, within Great Britain. you have to understand a lot of these acts, a lot of these things, these were still British citizens, but the questions started rising. Several different states are starting to really get a little bit aggro. Massachusetts in particular is going to be one of the more famous states in particular that's going to really start questioning things, and a lot of things are going to occur. There's the new prime minister, unfortunately, is going to be the one that's going to be levying a whole bunch of these things. Prime Minister Grenville, he's the guy that wrote and authored the Sugar Act and brought up, at the very least, the Stamp Act in 1765. He's also going to be one that's going to help pass what is known in that same year of 1765, the Quartering Act, which ultimately was going to solve a lot of the problems of stationing troops within North America, which you have to understand that there's about 10,000 plus troops all across the specific colonies to both protect it and also, let's be honest, keep things in check for a lot of different people by housing British troops. A lot of these acts are specifically fascinating. I'll put it to you that way. And this shows the disregard in a lot of ways, in fairness to the colonist perspective and point of view that Great Britain had for basically America and a lot of the British colonists. They did not think of them as their equals, and that really pissed off a lot of people. A lot of people are going to be writing during this time, specifically men like John Adams. Samuel Adams is going to start really writing a lot of his stuff, really beginning a bunch of his organizations, one very big famous one that we all know, and one that is a bit of an off-brand of this particular channel's namesake. New York, in particular, is actually going to have some contentious issues there. I mean, they would have a large contingent of forces in New York town in particular, with 1,500 troops arriving in 1766, in which the New York Assembly themselves refused to follow the actual Quartering Act. And a lot of people ultimately felt a lot of vindication for a lot of the things because of the unwritten British Constitution specifically. But ultimately, the government ultimately would argue in their particular in certain newspapers and to certain people that, they best knew how to maximize the returns of the possessions overseas, and that they are not equal in particular to the colonies. It wasn't equality. It was the colonies that were functionally dependent on Great Britain for ultimate success. And the British government themselves allowed, in some ways, to basically have some people in certain places talk, defend. One of the most famous individuals is James Otis himself, a lawyer and defender of specifically British liberty that would become the leading voice to the idea of taxation without representation. Specifically, the full quote, I believe, was "Taxation without representation is tyranny," when he speaks in the front of the Virginia House of Burgesses. Many other people are going to be there. Many other people are going to really see a lot of these fiery individuals. Patrick Henry himself would introduce the Virginia Stamp Act resolutions, denouncing the Stamp Act and British Crown in language that I can only say is Chad-like in every sense of the word. And basically, it begins divisions within this country where you start to see really three sides. You had people in the middle who were just didn't care. They wanted to be left alone like most normal people. Then you had your loyalists, the people who were basically saying, "What the hell, Patrick Henry, shut the fuck up. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're doing." And then you had the patriots, the men who will fight till the death for freedom and liberty because they believed in it. Patrick Henry himself, who was saying, "I'm a Chad, and I'm just gonna fucking be a Chad, so Chad up." Yeah. Anyways, Henry himself, when he's saying a whole bunch of these things, is the one that really made famous, although James Otis, like I said, is the one who I think really coined the specific phrase, "no taxation without representation." In the early goings, though, you have to understand there wasn't, hardcore, ardent patriotism the way that, we think of when we think of the men like Sam Adams, etc., etc. Patrick Henry really was a bit of a trendsetter in a lot of ways, and ultimately would be the person that would ignite the fires of a lot of young men and individuals, one in particular individual being Thomas Jefferson, and in a lot of ways George Washington, but it depends on how you look at it. But ultimately, for the most part, the patriotism that we see isn't as we see. Most of these people are still loyal to the British crown, even though, they're basically getting screwed over. In fact, in the early goings, most of the actual, I guess you could say, appeasement or the talks were basically discussions. Parliaments from several different state representations at one point met in 1765 in New York to reach a consensus to talk about the oppressiveness of the Stamp Act. It weakened the colonial economy, it weakened businesses, and really, above all else, like I said before, weakened the liberty under the British Constitution. So they created a document known as the Declarations of Rights and Grievances, which outlined the whole unconstitutionality of the taxation without representation, But as this is all going on, protests are gaining force, and this little Congress, I guess you could say, this little meeting between some of the state legislatures of these landowning, educated white men who represented, or I guess you could say was a colonial equivalent of the British land aristocracy, really started seeing, I guess you could say, a lot of the people, a lot of the anger, a lot of the frustration, and they themselves started understanding in the new Enlightenment period, the realm of rationality, that things are not looking very good. Things are not going good at all. In fact, things are going very bad. Once the Stamp Act really gets created, several different groups start forming. Two groups in particular, which, like I said, bear a resounding name to the very channel name, I guess you could say, the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty, in which they both led resistances that were creations from the Stamp Act itself. Both of them basically consider themselves British patriots defending their liberty, just as their forebears had done in the time of James II, and a whole bunch of different individuals and people. The Sons of Liberty are pretty straightforward and pretty well known, I think, throughout history. Most of these people were artisans, shopkeepers, merchants. Most of these people doing things and being forced to adopt, I guess you could say, technically speaking, illegal means to get through a whole bunch of different things in order to make a living. And also basically protesting their own unwritten British constitutional rights. Even before the act had actually gone into effect, once the word had gone out, the Sons of Liberty began protesting. They took aim at a man named Andrew Oliver, who was actually the man specifically in Massachusetts named to be the distributor of stamps, and they hanged Oliver in effigy. Not actually him, but basically a figurine that represented him, and stoned and ransacked his house. People were very brutal back then. Just imagine if we treated our politicians to like this today. I gotta be quite honest with you, I think they would be doing things very differently if we actually held them in check like that, But for the most part, things were very brutal. Things were very, very violent in a lot of ways. And ultimately, if you were a son, the sons, or true sons, true-born sons, or men who are committed to liberty, to distinguish the evil people, men like, at least in their minds, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who, because of his support for Parliament's actions, was considered an enemy of English liberty, where they basically looted and burned his house down. If you were a son of liberty, you basically fought long and hard. The men would do the actions of protesting, and even in a lot of ways, even though I don't condone it, violent nature and violent ways in order to get your fucking point across that, hey, we're not going away anytime soon. The Daughters of Liberty, though, I should probably point out, are very much more so just as important, They refused to buy the British goods, encouraging others to do the same. Built a community, a movement. Basically became, I guess you could say, the most capable individuals, because they basically decided they weren't going to rely on any British products whatsoever. Homespun their own clothes with, instead of buying British linen, British clothing, etc., etc. Getting all their sugar from any bees and honeycombs that they can possibly find. Little things like that. Going legal means, if necessary, in order to effectively, just do anything that's going to say fuck you to the British for the most part. They omitted tea from dinner and ultimately just said, fuck you, Great Britain, in their own particular way. Because you have to understand, if you were a woman, you didn't have any specific rights, which is also a bit of a fallout of the failures of the Constitution. Although, the great idea of America and the idea of liberty, freedom, etc., ultimately allows it to eventually happen, especially with the vote in 1917. But ultimately speaking, though, they couldn't do a whole bunch of different things, especially if they weren't married. But even if they were married, they could not make the decisions for the household. That was still, I believe, up to the men until later on within the 19th century itself. But effectively, their non-importation movement broadened the protest against the Stamp Act, basically refusing to purchase any goods whatsoever, and really mobilized people in a different landscape. Because, if you're Great Britain, you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, we've really pissed off the ladies. Okay, that's not good. And ultimately, King George III is not going to be a very happy camper. Prime Minister Grenville would be the person that King George is going to target first for the failures of the financial potential promise that the colonies would have and should have given him. He's fired. He's relinquished. He's replaced with a man named Lord Rockingham, who ultimately tells Parliament, hey, the Stamp Act's not going to work. Just get the thing out of here, for the most part. And basically, once that ends up happening, the colonists all celebrate. They all cheer. John Hancock's basically pouring drinks down girls' titties and whatnot. And honestly, it sounds like a pretty Gucci situation by all accounts. That being said, it was not going to be, I guess you could say, what people thought it was going to be like when Grenville leaves. Rockingham is not the man who's going to be a friend to the colonists. He in fact creates and proposes the Declaratory Act, that in no uncertain terms the Parliament's power was supreme, and that any laws that the colonies may have passed to govern and tax themselves were null and void if they were against the Parliament. Oof. They were not happy. And Rockingham's tenure would not be long. He would only be there for maybe the better part of a year. He dismissed Rockingham and ultimately ended up choosing a man named William Pitt, who was basically a sympathetic individual to the colonists for the most part, who would effectively succeeded him. But ultimately he was old with, an ill, had gout apparently. And ultimately ended up giving a lot of the power to his Chancellor of the Exchequer, whatever you want to call it, the Charles Townshend, whose job was to basically manage the Great Britain's finances, trying to push as much as he could to raise revenue within the colonies themselves. And yes, if you're wondering why this man, Charles Townshend, sounds very familiar, he's going to be the man, the act specifically is named after, the Townshend Acts. It's going to be a lot of acts in particular. The first act to deal with New York. New York is very unruly by this time. If you think Boston's a little bit cray-cray, New York is just as angry, just as mad. And, New York's Assembly, which had voted not to pay for the supplies of the specific contingent troops of British soldiers with the whole Quartering Act, because they refused to even house them. Townshend himself decided to propose a restraining act of 1767, disbanding New York's assembly until it agreed to pay the garrison's supplies, eventually and ultimately through force and just against their own will, agreed to do so. It ended up placing a whole bunch of different duties on everything: paper, paint, lead, tea, glass, and a lot of these goods had to be imported, unfortunately, since the colonists did not have the mills, did not have the capabilities or the specific individuals and people to produce a lot of these goods and services for the most part. Benjamin Franklin, a man who was basically so for the British, is starting to look at the British as monsters. I've never heard any objection to the right of laying duties to regulate commerce, but a right to lay internal taxes was never supposed to be in Parliament, as we are not represented there, says Benjamin Franklin. The Indemnity Act of 1767 exempted tea produced by the British East Indian Company from taxation when it was imported to Great Britain. The East Indian Trading Company, and specifically the tea revenue that they had, was going downhill very fast. The colonists really did hurt them in a lot of ways, and ultimately the tea was not very good. A lot of people felt that specifically this Indemnity Act was incredibly horrible. It effectively just forced them to buy only this particular tea, raising the tax and everything else but this particular tea, and ultimately creating a bit of a monopoly in its place for the most part for this tea. The revenue collected from these duties was only nominally intended to support the British colony, but in fact, which pissed off a lot of people, ended up paying the salaries of a whole bunch of specifically loyalist judges, governors, and officials. And thanks to these, Townshend Acts and the Townshend Revenue Acts, they basically were in a lot of ways self-reliant because of these taxes. They didn't specifically have to be paid by the colonists themselves, but they actually could just tax the colonists and force them to pay these individuals and people. You have to understand, a lot of people don't like that. It basically just severs what effectively is representation in a lot of ways. That, Great Britain, in a lot of ways, because of financial neediness, because of them in a lot of ways not understanding the monster they're creating, ultimately. It's one thing to actually see it with your own eyes, but then to be thousands of miles away giving out a whole bunch of different orders. They do not know the monster that is brewing, that is in the United States. Because of all these acts, because of all these moves, because Great Britain refused to understand what effectively will become the United States of America, ultimately led to rampant, I guess you could say, smuggling, bribery, trade, debauchery in a lot of ways, at least in terms of, I guess, relative crime, or at least what could be considered relative crime, even back then. Ultimately, just creating a whole bunch of different extra regulations. But what I'm trying to say is, once you put these laws in, that force people to really kind of do a whole bunch of different things in order to make a living. And these laws really, for the most part, affected the poor people, a lot of poor people, because you have your rich people, not everyone was like George Washington, who had plantations and, literally at least, 40,000 acres. There's just some people who have small little pieces of land that are trying to make do, and if I can't sell my grain or my corn or my tobacco for in all these things, because the taxes that I'm gonna have to end up paying ultimately are going to, and keep in mind, these taxes aren't insane, but back then when you have a whole bunch of different things that you have to really go into just in order to survive, it's very difficult. It's like, say you make $10 a week, and you end up getting taxed, I don't know, maybe like a nickel for every little heap of tobacco, that's a lot of money, for at least, especially in that particular point in time. This leads to bribery, smuggling, a whole bunch of different things that ultimately end up creating more laws, more regulations. Writs of assistance ultimately end up getting created, and they end up creating Townshend yet again. Introduced the Commissioners of Customs Act of 1767 that same year, in which they basically create the American variation of customs, I guess you could say. Literally, that's going to review a whole bunch of different imports and exports. Smuggling was rampant and only increased in Great Britain. Another one of these, factors ultimately ends up cracking down on more things, which just pisses off a whole slew of people, a whole bunch of different individuals that just don't like it. Courts themselves would be drastically changed too. With the Vice Admiralty Court Act that same year too, another Townshend Act ultimately is going to change how juries are going to work, how courts are going to work. Before, you had a jury of your peers, specifically of your actual colonial peers, but now you don't even have a jury. You don't have anything for the most part, and a lot of these judges are being paid effectively through the taxes gained from actual trade imports and exports, so they might end up being a little bit more, I guess you could say, less lenient than normal, since most of their salaries are going to be going away because you tended to not pay their dues, etc., etc. People were different back then, times were different back then. In England, because of these rules and regulations, their debt was being rampant. They're becoming a lot more desperate. They're becoming a lot more tighter in a lot of ways that one can, really understand to an extent why they went down this hardcore path and this hardcore direction. You have to understand, too, King George is really pushing, down the neck of Townshend and a whole bunch of different people. If things don't change, then he's going to get the boot, or, it's all about power. And no matter how good of intentions I think people have, or what people think they are going to do, because a lot of these, parliamentary individuals, it's kind of like this. It's like when a president goes into the office for the very first time. They have all these ideas and these, plans are going to do, and within a year or two, most of them and a lot of them end up just doing, just whatever. For the most part, they go with whatever the party wants, etc., etc. You know how it goes sometimes, and a lot of these prime ministers in Great Britain are no different. The only difference is that person that's breathing down their neck, that group, it's the king, and the ultimate power, the ultimate say of basically anything, and power really won't be usurped from the king until the tail end, I guess you could say, of Queen Victoria's time, but that would be in the next century. Fires from people's tummies, I guess you could say, are being lit in every sense of the word. If you thought taxation without representation was bad, this was, tenfold worse. Every single law and rule and act that they end up imposing ultimately ends up just making things worse, and if you thought that there was any discrepancy, if someone basically said, you're a conspiracy theorist, these things aren't that bad, these British aren't going to basically end up being just tyrannies and monarchies and monsters and dictators and authoritarians in a whole bunch of different ways, and once they start initiating these acts, it's very hard to look away from reality, to be honest with you. That's right in your face, and this is around the time when a lot of the most prominent, I guess you could say, patriots, and I don't even want to say founding fathers, a lot of influential people are going to be coming around this time, around this era, and ultimately, great men like John Dickinson, for instance, would write a whole bunch of different pamphlets, a whole bunch of different writings, protest writings specifically, letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, which is one of the more influential pamphlets around that time, basically said that, the empire could regulate trade, but, that the parliament cannot impose either internal taxes, stamps, goods, external taxes, imports, etc., etc. Basically, you can tell us what to do and how we're going to do it. You can tell us who to trade with. That's fine. But if you're going to tell us, we have to pay this or that for without any representation or any meaningful way, just because you are this parliament does not mean you are Britain. It's one of those little things. At least that's in a lot of ways how some people have interpreted it. Excuse me. And then Sam Adams, who's going to be one of the biggest leaders, who's going to ignite the revolution, who's going to ignite, the fiery powers. He is a part of the Sons of Liberty himself. And he's a small member, at least in the early goings, and it isn't until the latter parts of 1768, 69, 70 when he becomes the firebrand, the fire starter, and the leader within the Boston revolutions, and the big Sons of Liberty leader who's going to be a part of the whole Boston Tea Party, etc., etc. He would write a letter that would be known today as the Massachusetts Circular. He sent, I believe he sent it to the actual Massachusetts House of Representatives and to other colonial legislators, basically saying that the unconstitutionality of taxation without representation, and basically said, hey, colonies, we actually might need to boycott some stuff. We might actually need to really become violent if necessary. We need to actually do some stuff. It is the wise thing to do, because that those people in Parliament, they don't know what they're doing. They don't deserve to put these taxes on us. They don't have the right to impose the duties on the people of this province. And basically, they infringe when they do this our natural and constitutional rights. A lot of these things are always going to go back to the taxation of without representation. But a whole bunch of different people basically were just like, okay, people had this idea back then, but James Otis and Patrick Henry, their words only went so far. Once other people from other colonies, Massachusetts in particular, start saying a whole bunch of different things like this, and specifically it's trying to spread to all the other colonies. A lot of people are trying to wake up to a potential reality of what's going to happen. Maybe something big might happen. Maybe a revolution. Who knows? History is fascinating because, when we look back on the Massachusetts Circular, when it goes to a whole bunch of different colonies, some books would say that it's this big firebrand starter, but I would actually probably say it's close to a much more lukewarm reception. It did ignite some people, and I think enough people in certain colonies got things started, but, it wasn't going to, activate a third of the patriot cause like the revolution ultimately would, it specifically. And actually probably only, ignited a whole bunch of different Sons of Liberty branches across the country, but not a whole lot to really genuinely be scared about. But Britain was scared. They had faced a whole bunch of different issues beforehand, and they didn't want to face any more issues. In fact, they had even legislated specifically that anyone specifically in Great Britain, I believe it was the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Hillsborough, demanding that the Massachusetts letter be retracted, and anyone who endorsed it, their specific assembly, the New York Assembly, would be dissolved, etc., etc. Especially even in Philadelphia, which basically was funny because I believe Philadelphia might have been one of the original cities to actually refuse or oppose the circular, them basically being targeted by Mr. Hillsborough himself, ultimately just made a lot of the colonists, a lot of the individuals, and a lot of the people basically just go, you can't tell us what to do. I look at it this way, it's basically them kind of just shooting himself in the foot. This letter probably wouldn't have done as much in just another ramblings of a madman, a mad patriot man who just wants this country to be free. Yet the reaction, harsh, very brash, and very rough in a lot of ways, would piss off a whole lot of people within the country. More protests and riots would begin to occur again. Philadelphia, who said, we don't endorse this letter, basically hearing this is like, well, Britain, you can go fuck yourself, and basically just said, we endorse this letter now just because of you, just to say fuck you. The Sons of Liberty start doing their thing again, basically saying, fuck off merchants, taking over certain towns and certain cities and harassing British troops, specifically. The Daughters of Liberty continue embargoing a whole bunch of different non-importation agreements, and really began hurting, I guess you could say, the British dollar and the British financial pursuits that they're trying to do with their taxes and everything that they're trying to do, ultimately. What's fascinating, I think, is that ultimately things were changing, things were shifting. The financial debt that was happening did two things. It started making things, well, it did one thing, but affected America and Britain in various different ways. Basically you could tell the difference between someone in America who was a part of the movement, this rebellious movement, these rebels in a lot of ways, just by, whether they wore their own homespun clothing versus, really fancy British attire for the most part, or British linen in particular, little things like that tend to change the mood. And 67 to 68 were very tumultuous times. Both economies in the United States and Great Britain were struggling in a lot of ways. Even the rich, the more aristocracy, and the elitist individuals, men like George Washington, Adams in a lot of ways, Jefferson, they started seeing a lot of the signs. The big thinkers in a lot of ways were thinking, maybe we could use this to our advantage. Maybe we could actually think about, if we do create this new government, a lot of these people being in the legislature already, men like Adams, Jefferson, Washington, or Jefferson, I don't believe at this particular moment yet, but he will be eventually. But, it's about time, place, and opportunity for a lot of these people. But, the rumblings of what's going to happen are occurring. Great Britain's thinking this is a bit of a culture war and that they have to win the culture, and they're thinking of different ways to go about doing it, to be quite honest with you. But ultimately, events will, which I will explain in just a minute, will change the purview of what's going to effectively happen, and at least what they will attempt, at least in the culture shift, will have drastically varying results. But in America, things were very differing. Things were very difficult. People were divided on a whole bunch of different things. The patriot base is very much ignited, especially in the Northeast, and specifically within Massachusetts and in Boston in particular. In Virginia as well. And if you were basically a patriot, you could tell by, like I said, your clothing, the way you ate, drank. A lot of people didn't buy tea. A lot of people would basically scavenge for a bunch. They would live off their own lands instead of trying to get British goods or anything along those lines for the most part. And people were still very loyal. A lot of people were still very loyal. People don't like each other. Cultural differences are starting to break this country apart in a lot of ways. And a real debate starting to really begin, in taverns, cafes, the equivalent of, just some boarding houses. People, staying up, drinking, and just enjoying the night sky and just talking about, we need Britain. No, we don't need Britain. Yes, we do. No, we don't, And these were the talks that were happening around this age. Your people are starting to question whether, they can actually be independent, whether they can actually think for themselves. Do we need this, or can we just be brave and venture into something that's quite unknown? Parliament, meanwhile, they're fighting each other. They're really very serious, very stern, very scared of what's going to happen. The disagreements that are happening have never truly happened in this level of severity. I think the level that it's reached, specifically in one particular city, in Boston, Massachusetts. Many are divided on what to actually do. Some are basically just, we need to appease, maybe we should actually just lift back some of the restrictions and allow people to, do free trade, etc., or at the very least, restrict some of the things that basically forced smuggling, etc., and just, have them pay a small level of taxes and actually, lower the debt over time. But others, they're mad, they're frustrated. How dare you question the British Empire, the Parliament, us? A lot of these people are going to have a lot of sway and a lot of influence, and, instead of a peaceful solution, a lot of these moments I tend to think are just moments of escalation. One person just keeps escalating and escalating and escalating. Next thing you know, war is going to break out. And this is just one of these, moments in particular that's going to grossly escalate into specifically conflict. In late 1768, Lord Hillsborough, the man who's going to be the American Secretary of State in particular, is going to be sent about 4,000 British troops specifically to Boston, Massachusetts. He is there, and many of the men there are there to deal with the unrest, a lot of the potential rebellions that are occurring there, to deal with the rampant smuggling that's going on over there that's hurting British commerce, as Boston's one of the more important port cities within the country itself. Things were only making it worse. The aggressive laws that were already in place within the country are only making things worse. More quartering, more people basically having to pay more excessive levels of taxes. The British there are really clamping down on smuggling in a whole bunch of different ways. A lot of these British end up kind of going undercover. This fellow Johnny Longbottoms is going to be working at the docks, taking away, American jobs. Little things like that tend to occur, which only expedite different, issues. And then, there's going to be some conflicts between them because, he's a British, fight him, and a lot of issues, a lot of conflicts, a lot of fighting ultimately end up occurring around this particular time. I tend to make fun of a man named John Hancock for a lot of reasons, to be quite honest with you, because first off, his fucking name is hilarious, but at the very same end of the spectrum, there are many reasons why he's a very important individual within the times of the Founding Fathers, and why he is a fascinating Founding Father for a lot of reasons. It's during this particular point in time, he's one of the more prominent merchants within Massachusetts itself, and ultimately is one of the key figures who effectively ends up facilitating most of the smuggling, first and foremost because he's a member of the Sons of Liberty, but also he can make a pretty penny around this time too. Tensions rise though when one of his ships, the ship is called Liberty, violence erupted. The Sons of Liberty and Bostonians rioted against customs officials, blocking a whole bunch of shenanigans that were going on. The Sons of Liberty chased out customs officials, attacking the customs house, chasing out the officers who ran away to safety at the local Castle William, a British fort that was on Boston Harbor. British soldiers eventually, over quite a few hours, quieted the riots. But, more of these rising tensions ultimately will occur over time. For the next 2 years, people are going to be basically battling each other through both in all the colonies, but primarily and specifically within Boston and Massachusetts in particular, which is going to be the hotbed of revolutionary fervor. Specifically, this idea of freedom, this idea of patriotism is really going to foment, and a lot of ideas are going to start occurring. A lot of these young American, European, Greek-influenced, Roman-influenced philosophical minds, the minds of Adams, Jefferson, a lot of these people who are eventually going to be founding fathers. And specifically men who are going to influence this country, ultimately are going to influence a lot of people. John Adams is going to have his own specific column where he talks about letters, etc., writes about republics left and right, and the ideas of republicanism, and functionally why republics could really work, and talking about effectively people rising up, representative rule, and ideas that really will stem, and a lot of people are going to take in stride, because you have to understand, rising and rebelling is one thing, but when ideas start becoming fomented around this time of, we could actually create some sort of representative government. We can actually, if we do rebel and we can create our own nation, we could do this, This is when things and that idea starts really being permeated in a whole bunch of different people's minds, and a lot of these people, a lot of these patriots start really, aggressively believing in it for better, and at times for worse, but ultimately for better. Ultimately, I would say I like my country, so things really start coming to a head, though. The attacks between the Sons of Liberty, for instance, and the British start really escalating, every day. By the time 1770 is trying to come around, the British are basically just walking the streets, just enjoying their lives, and they get pushed around by Bostonians, for instance, and tensions rise as, like I said, if you do that every day, people are going to start getting mad. People will just stand up for themselves. And, next thing you know, one instance where a whole bunch of Bostonians are harassing a couple British soldiers. And then they decide, you know what, I've had enough of this. And they stand up. And they have guns. And there's a lot of them with guns. And a lot of people feel threatened. They start throwing rocks, snowballs. They get very mad. They get very frustrated. They start cursing at them. A lot more people start joining, and a lot more individuals start getting more violent, more angry. There's a real tension within the air itself. You can cut it with a samurai sword. That's how fucking thick it is. It's so thick. That's what she said. And people are panicking on both sides, but ultimately the soldiers they fear for their lives. They ready their guns. That's only making the crowd angrier, more people more mad. And next thing you know, on March 5th, 1770, those men fire. Those men fire within the mob itself, and they kill 5 people. Crispus Attucks, the first man killed, and no one could have known it back then, but you can consider him the actual first official casualty in the war for independence. He was a man of Wampanoag and African descent. Once 1770 hits, bloodshed has finally occurred. Hostilities have developed to a specific level that the Bostonian occupation by British troops was very much toxic, was very much dangerous, was very much, very, very warlike. The Sons of Liberty capitalized on this event, for better or worse. Support was ramped up. There were more patriots now more than ever, but people who were on the opposite side were now more on the opposite side. More famous founding fathers, more famous individuals, men like Paul Revere, who I think he was a silversmith, was a member of the Sons of Liberty, circulated engravings of a line of redcoats firing ruthlessly into a crowd of unarmed fleeing citizens. They really called this the massacre, even though it was much more of a mob rule and unfortunate event, ultimately. And the truth is that there were a lot more people that, were level-headed, common-sense individuals who basically said, this is unnecessary. Don't make this bigger than it should be. A lot of these individuals, men like John Adams himself, But the damage was done ultimately. People were riled up. People were angry. Just imagine every night people protesting, people with torches, people with pitchforks, people with swords, guns, looking for British troops who were all very scared, who would, go in large groups just to avoid any large-scale confrontation, at the very least, anything that could lead to large-scale confrontation. They're not going to be alone. They're not going to be in small groups like that again. And meanwhile, you do have some normal Bostonian people who are trying to calm the people down. Men like John Adams. John Adams, a man who was always an advocate of peaceful protests in every meaningful way. Being some of the most brave individuals within the city itself. John Adams is famous specifically around this time before becoming one of the most profound and truly incredibly and underrated founding fathers of all time, is ultimately going to represent the men who killed the 5 Bostonian citizens in the trial for the men of the Boston Massacre. Arguing that the mob's lawlessness required the soldiers' response. That law and order in a society, if you didn't have it, there was no society. He basically just points out the truth and the reality that, this was a street ball that basically pushed injustice of imperial policy. And, basically you're just pointing at these people just being British as cause that, that's not fair. They're human beings and they're people, and the truth is that things are just much more complicated than they actually are, which does not help with his rampant and very patriotic, rebellious cousin Samuel Adams. Ultimately, though, he will free the men on these charges specifically. He will free 6 of them. 2 others ultimately will be reduced to a smaller charge of manslaughter, which in case they will be locked in prison instead of hanged or shot at the wall. Ultimately, the Sons of Liberty would win. Their media campaign went pretty far and wide, to be quite honest with you. You should see some of the newspapers basically stating that this was a planned attack. The British had planned this from the get-go, and really just trying to warp media, which I think, look, I love my country and I love American history, but, once you understand your history and understand the finer details, it makes things a little more sus, if that makes any sense, to be quite honest with you. I think their intentions were good, but you have to understand that, rebels, like Sons of Liberty, ultimately, they weren't always the good guys, to be quite honest with you. So one must understand them, and one must understand functionally the lengths that sometimes they would go, ultimately, to achieve their means. But ultimately, their means they did achieve. I should have probably brought this up. Townshend himself would actually die, unfortunately, in I think 1768 specifically. He would be replaced by the new Prime Minister, Lord North himself, who had basically seen a lot of the issues that were arising, the rising tensions that were occurring within this country, and ultimately was much more level-headed, much more common sense, I think, than Townshend, and wasn't going to be bullied by Parliament in most of the ways, at least in some of the early goings. And Lord North himself ultimately ended up repealing some of the acts, specifically some of the taxes, and ultimately some of the regulatory issues that went along with it. They ended up repealing enough things to a point where Bostonians cheered. And it's funny because immediately after, finances from both the United States and Great Britain went up. People just said, fuck it. We won in a lot of ways. We ended up winning a whole bunch of our different battles, and we got our liberties back. And, British goods and purchases on British goods ultimately skyrocketed, and trade was much more facilitated. And people were happy, or at least for the time being, on some goods and some services, but things don't last, and nothing truly lasts, to be quite honest with you. And as history will note, within 8 years, or 6 years specifically, from 1770, a new nation is going to be born. I would say, in fact, in truth, the damage is already done. There was no going back, ultimately, once the Pandora's box was open, once the Sons of Liberty ultimately got their way, once, things had happened, once people died, there really was no going back. As the ultimate and unfortunate reality of the particular situation, and the reality is, too, that, Not every single thing was repealed. Most states and most cities, and many of the port cities they had, and most of their economy was built around mercantile ship, ultimately had to deal still with the British issues and the British people who were still basically just, hey, I'm still gonna, customize or go through all your stuff and make sure there's no smuggling going on here. Daily irritants, and people were still reminded of British power. We may have won this battle, but they still may have just won the war. And this is where political discussions get heightened. The ideas of men like John Locke, many of his books on government, Wealth of Nations, 2 Treaties of Government, start basically going into, public houses, and people really start talking about politics. And you have to understand what influences a lot of people back then, especially if you were an aristocratic individual. Then a lot of the founding fathers believed in the ideas of the Greeks. The Greeks back then believed if you were a free citizen, if you were a free man, if you were someone who was an independent individual, then you would be able to talk politics. You'd be able to talk about things within your community that you can influence, and talk about the things that you agree with specifically and don't agree with. You are an informed person, an informed individual, and the founding fathers, and specifically the Sons of Liberty, would take advantage of this. And the Sons of Liberty themselves basically use propaganda all across this country to keep people aware that Parliament was still there. The British were still there. That King George III is still there. That they are overreaching, and they will overreach again. I liken it to today in a lot of ways, where I think a lot more people are much more aware of the things than they have been in quite a long time, where they're not as accepting of their government in a lot of ways that they have been in quite a long time. And I think that's actually a really good thing. And, back then, it's the same vein, for better or worse, people were very wary of Great Britain, and, more than ever. Anytime Great Britain overstepped in any semblance, in any single way, things would occur. One of the biographies and one of the books on the American Revolution and early American history always talks about in 1772, Rhode Island colonists boarded and burned the British revenue ship Giuseppe in Narragansett Bay. I am terrible at my pronunciation. Narragansett Bay. Yes, I just did that, because I might be a little dumb, so I do apologize. The colonists had attacked and burned the British customs ships in the past, but after what would be known as the Giuseppe affair, the British government convened their Royal Commission of Inquiry. They basically went full authoritarian in every sense of the word to remove the colonists, charge them with treason, bring them to Great Britain for trial. A gross overreach in a lot of ways, even though technically speaking it was in colonial lands, And Samuel Adams, along with a whole bunch of different people, notably James Otis himself, reformed what would be the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which formed in a lot of ways as a shadow government. A lot of these committees would be created, and a lot of these committees would pop up, and they would help address the fear of British overreach, all over Massachusetts. There have been so many committees, and a whole bunch of the other colonies ended up following suit. A lot of these men, 7,000 to 8,000 per committee, even, all identified enemies of the movement, communicated the news. It was truly a fascinating network of men who were basically communicating, hey, this guy's a British spy, the first true spy network in a lot of ways. And, people will look at this in a various different perspectives and points of view, and it's all, some people could just say it's just people working together, but, news travels fast, and people were able to communicate very swiftly with one another in this endeavor. And more than ever, unity was really needed between the colonies as they started coming to a realization and things were escalating. Violence was more so reoccurring than had been in, relatively speaking, the last year or so, from 1770 to 1771, where, they basically had some semblance of peace, but, peace can only last so long. Fighting's occurring. Issues with natives will always occur, to be quite honest with you, during this time. But ultimately, Great Britain is really just trying to figure some things out. They're trying to understand a lot of the issues that are occurring. There's more violence, there's more rampant patriotism, and Great Britain's trying to figure out how to stop this, how to really, figure some things out. And I think they have some ideas and some plans, but unfortunately, again, life works in mysterious ways, and in a lot of ways, I think, at least in Britain, this might have appeared to be, relatively speaking, a clearly biased act to really just protect them, instead of actually creating a semblance of, I guess you could say, taxation or imperial. This is more of a protectionist issue, but the Tea Act of 1773 wasn't to punish the colonists or even to actually directly tax them or raise revenue. The act itself was to economically protect the British, specifically. The Tea Act of 1773 gave basically the East Indian Company, on the verge of bankruptcy, I think around this particular point in time, free reign to sell their tea directly to the colonists without having to pay imports, without having to pay a whole bunch of different things. This is basically just, the government going directly and assisting specifically like a corporation in a lot of ways, and giving them tax breaks, which made things very difficult for the colonists and a lot of people there. A lot of the individuals, the founding fathers in particular, would get Dutch tea that they would smuggle in to effectively, pay cheaper sums. But if your, British tea from the East Royal Company is going to be much cheaper without the taxes, then it's like, what's the point? For a lot of the people, it was whatever. But for many of the patriots, many of the Sons of Liberty, that was a straw that broke the camel's back. Debates, they rage on within the colony itself. People are upset. And, a lot of people, the loyalists, basically like, you're tripping. You need to calm down about this whole British thing because we get our tea for free. You're just a radical, insane person trying to justify every single negative thing that the British Empire does. And the patriots are like, this is hypocrisy. This is clear imperialism, and this is clearly benefiting one company, one corporation, one country more than anything else. And it's undercutting a lot of things, a lot of the efforts that we've been basically doing here for the most part. And a lot of these people are getting mad, and it's not helping that, a lot of the governors, specifically Thomas Hutchinson, he was now the royal governor of Massachusetts. He vows radicals like Samuel Adams would not keep the ships from unloading their cargo, directly calling them out and telling merchants to dock their ships. And, these are basically just fighting words in a lot of ways. And ultimately, it takes just one brave ship to try and make it to port. So in November of 1773, the ship named the Dartmouth would sail into Boston Harbor. It had 20 days to unload its cargo of tea and pay the duty before it had to go back to the United Kingdom, or England specifically. And then two more ships, Eleanor and the Beaver, came after. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty tried to keep the captains of the ships from paying the duties and posted groups around the ships so that no one would leave and no one would be able to pay the duties. So just imagine a lot of the Sons of Liberty just walking around ships, maybe with guns, pistols, mad as all hell. A whole bunch of different outfits going on, probably homemade and home woven, looking very mad. And a lot of the people are very upset, and it would be next month, December 16th. Dartmouth's deadline is fast approaching. A lot of the townspeople, they're basically kind of just curious to see what's happening during this specific standoff that's occurring. A month-long siege against these three specific ships. The entire townsfolk are there, and ultimately they're curious. a group of Sons of Liberty and their followers. They went straight up to the three ships. Some were disguised as Mohawks. They were protected by a lot of people, a lot of the spectators there, and ultimately ended up dumping a lot of tea into the water. Estimates vary. They always do. We don't know the specific amount that was specifically dumped, but it would be the equivalent of today about $1 million worth of tea, which, let's be honest, for tea, that's a lot of money in tea. Can you imagine 1 million Arizona iced teas, for instance, that's literally 1 million Arizona iced teas being dumped into the water. That's fucking insane, okay? And I want to go more in depth probably in another episode specifically on the Boston Tea Party. It's deeply fascinating, and a lot of the members that are a part of it are very important to the overall story of the Patriots and basically the American Revolution. But ultimately, the dumping of the tea might have been the specific catalyst moment of the point of no return. Truly, to be quite honest with you, you want to talk about moments. You want to talk about specifically, like, what was the moment that started World War I? It wasn't just the buildup of a whole bunch of different countries basically just building up their arms, having imperialistic ambitions. Now, it was the moment that Archduke Franz Ferdinand is shot, and next thing you know, boom, acts after acts, Germany declares war, England declares war, France declares war, and next thing you know, 15 million plus people are going to die because of that. Now, I'm not saying that, by any stretch of the imagination, that death toll is going to come close within this entire conflict. But in terms of a cataclysmic change, which is why we always really look at moments like this, the Boston Tea Party, as moments that should always be etched in history. When we look at when George Washington crosses the Delaware, it's not because he crossed the Delaware and defeated the Hessians on Christmas Day. No, it was because Washington himself and then the Revolutionary Army, the Continental Army, were on their last legs. They lose this battle, we lose this revolution and this war. And ultimately, them making this brave journey, this bold move to attack in winter when no one attacked in the winter, that was something else. The Boston Tea Party is just like that. It's just that important. It's just that incredible. From this point on, the American Revolution, for better or worse, was going to happen and going to occur. And everything that happens because of this moment, because of this specific event, ultimately is going to create and become the catalyst for what this republic is going to be. The people who are going to step up to create this republic and create effectively the country that we live in today. It really begins here. The British, they were very upset. The Parliament was very upset, but no one was more angry. No one was more frustrated. No one was much more appalled and infuriated than King George III himself. Basically, a lot of merchants, American merchants, fearing a lot of the potential danger that the actual, Boston Tea Party was going to effectively do to their trade, their mercantile ship, ultimately decided, hey man, we'll pull all our money together and actually pay off this bullshit, because this is just not going to happen. We're going to be losing a lot of money because of your guys' inferiority and just not inferiority, but just your patriotism, your frustrations, and your fury. Fury is the word I'm trying to look for. And a lot of the people in Massachusetts basically just, they stood their ground. The Massachusetts Assembly themselves were basically just like, no, you can go fuck off. And a lot of the men, a lot of these patriots, and there's a lot of people in the middle. John Adams, I believe, around this point, still in the middle. He's basically just like, hey guys, can we not go crazy yet? At this point, the only real opportunity that we have to keep everything together ultimately is just to, keep some semblance of ties. But at the same time, truth is that secretly he was also a secret member and supporter of the Boston Tea Party. And actually, would be one of the individuals that would represent them if a court case had actually had become of their actions. But ultimately, what Britain wanted was more. Great Britain, seeing the resistance to British authority, ultimately forced them and forced their hand, basically saying that Massachusetts and basically the entire state itself has to pay for the tea and yield to British authority. King George III being the individual, the catalyst for a lot of this. Lord North ultimately agreeing with the king himself, specifically saying that, they need to pay. Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects, plundered your merchants, burnt your ships, denied all obedience to your laws and authority, and so long forbearing has our conduct been that it is incumbent on us now to take a different course, whatever the consequences may be. We must risk something. If we do not, all is over. Very early the following year, months after, I would say, the Boston Tea Party itself, a series of four measures, specifically on Massachusetts, specifically designed to punish Massachusetts, would be known as the Coercive Acts. Now, there's a whole bunch of different acts that are going to go along with it, and I'll explain them, right now. The first would be the Boston Port Act. That basically just shut down the entirety of Boston Harbor until the retribution for the East Indian Company and the tea itself, the $1 million effective, was going to be paid, shutting down anything mercantile ships blocked by British ships, which scared a lot of people. Next was the Massachusetts Government Act, which placed the colonial government specifically and directly under the control of the British, and specifically loyalist or, I guess you could say, crown officials, basically saying that, if anything was going to go through with the town, you had to go through the crown itself. You had to go through British authority itself. If you wanted to have a dinner party at your house, you had to get an okay for it. If you want to hold a town meeting, you had to get the okay for it. The Administrative of Justice Act allowed the royal governor of Massachusetts, still there specifically, to basically unilaterally move any trial of a crown officer out of Massachusetts, basically designed to prevent the hostile Massachusetts juries from deciding cases, which that one I can actually understand specifically, but point being, not okay there still. And, and the truth is that, at that point, and it's actually kind of funny. I think an act like that actually ended up hurting more so than I think a lot of people had intended. It was one of those acts that made a lot of Massachusetts individuals, people who were kind of in the middle, and the founding fathers in particular, specifically John Adams himself, was really infuriated by that act. He always is say what you will about John Adams, he was always about the rule of law and order. He saw this as striking the heart of equitable justice in a lot of ways, and ultimately the final act would be the Quartering Act, encompassed in all of the colonies that allowed British troops to be housed in occupied buildings. Sorry about that. On top of that too, Great Britain was really laying the groundwork for a lot of their colonies, a lot of their lands for the most part. You have to remember too, Great Britain had a lot of colonies in Canada as well, who were very apprehensive specifically to a lot of the things that were happening in the 13 colonies below, and ultimately lines are going to be drawn there, and with a whole bunch of different things under the Quebec Act, which basically expanded the boundaries of Quebec westward, and religious tolerance to a whole bunch of different Catholics within the prominence as well. So, religiousness and religious freedom with people that were still not very religiously tolerant within the country was a bit of an issue still back then. But ultimately, my whole point being that divides are occurring, divides are happening throughout North America itself, including Canada, which is fascinating because, during the American Revolution, those 13 colonies in particular are going to be very separate from the northern Canadian colonies in particular, who are going to be going through their own various different processes, and ultimately they will stay British for quite a long time, to be honest with you. And, everything's working. Every single little thing's kind of going along with each other. People are still divided. The actual fighting between loyalists and patriots really start occurring at this point, and this becomes a bit of a culture war, culture battle, effectively, and people are really divided. Some want to just go back to normalcy, and others realize there's no turning back. If you want to know why these coercive acts sound so familiar, these 4 intolerable acts, it's because they would be renamed specifically as known as the intolerable acts. There's a bunch of cartoons, a lot of different people that, common sense individuals would basically just be like, okay, this is too far, and a lot of people were just completely disaffected ultimately with Great Britain. By 1774, many of the colonists, a whole bunch of, it's because, it's also happened in Massachusetts, but, a lot of the other colonies, New York, Virginia in particular, they're basically like, we have a lot of patriots here. That could happen to us. They might just go apeshit on us just because we might not agree with everything that they say. What's going to happen? And ultimately, a lot of these colonists decided, we should probably talk about it. We should probably discuss this in an open forum. Maybe we could create a meeting. So, after some time, some letter sending, some negotiations, the resulting meeting would be known as the First Continental Congress. It was a direct challenge, just these colonies meeting in particular, to British authority against Great Britain. And you have to understand, this wasn't specifically like, oh my god, war is about to happen. In fact, this wasn't. A lot of these people who actually joined in the First Continental Congress were loyalists, a lot of these people. And the debates really were just basically, how do we stop these things from happening? Can we go back to Britain? Even John Adams is trying to find and figure out a peaceful solution, for the most part, to a lot of the issues there during the First Continental Congress. The only representative that wouldn't make it is Georgia, who had a very strong royal loyalist governor. And as I believe I've noted before, Georgia was created specifically as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the strong colonies of the Carolinas. This First Continental Congress would meet in Philadelphia. They'd meet from September 5th from October 26th. Representative and the most important individuals from all across the country, men like George Washington, John Adams, Hancock, many of the patriots, founding fathers that would be important to the overall American Revolution and effectively the first real standardized and constitutional government that we would have in this country, Articles of Confederation and the Constitution itself. They would have to be able to talk a whole bunch of different things. The Suffolk resolves. I'm terrible at pronouncing a whole bunch of different things, but ultimately, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress passed these resolves, which laid out a plan of resistance to the intolerable acts themselves that the First Continental Congress is going to have to figure out. There's a whole bunch of different things that they have to discuss, that they have to try and figure out. And ultimately, a lot of these people argued for specifically a conciliatory approach. Basically, a parliament within America themselves it was basically a grand council, I think that they would call it specifically, and effectively create their own variation of a British parliament and government that was going to basically be an open communication to the crown. And basically, for the most part, the more radical individuals, the more patriot-minded individuals were basically saying, no, fuck that, we need to separate from the crown, and many of these people are going to start debating a lot of the issues for the next month or so. And ultimately, The first Continental Congress will resolve these issues with effectively their declaration and resolves, the document that would be adopted on October 14th that would demand the repeal of all repressive acts passed since 1773, non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation pacts against all British goods until the acts were basically repealed, basically saying, if you don't give us what we want, we will just shut down your economy from here, and we will live on our own. They would petition the king, the Congress, to the king, and basically saying that if you don't do this, we will fight. We will prepare for combat. Militia start rising up. George Washington, notably himself, raises a small army of a couple thousand men, and things start taking the first steps. They start taking the first steps of establishing a fascinating and unique structure, a network, of government in a lot of ways, where a lot of these people, a lot of these representatives are representing their states, their own countries in a lot of ways. Maryland, not Maryland, Virginia, technically Maryland, but, Rhode Island, a whole bunch of Massachusetts that represent their own various countries at this point. Because you have to understand the 13 colonies, they are not the United States. They are their own states, and they are effectively their own countries. They have different ideas, perspectives, and point of views. A man from Massachusetts is going to be very different from a man in Virginia. But they are united in the resolve against Britain to say fuck you, ultimately, to them. And they decide in a lot of ways that this meeting is pretty eventful, that we're all united in the same ideas and the same front, and that, we might have to unite, and that we might have to actually create something that's bigger than us and better than us. And ultimately, in preparation for the war itself, in preparation for things that might occur, the United States will be born. With the first Continental Congress meeting and a lot of these individuals agreeing in a lot of ways that, the first steps of walking away from Great Britain were occurring. The war was really just beginning, the war for independence, and although it would begin the following year in 1775, the rumblings are beginning in 1774, and specifically the epicenter of Massachusetts itself, Boston specifically. The Great British Empire, and they have many great generals, they have many great officers, and they have many great military leaders. They would have some of the most famous military generals of all time. One of the more famous ones, probably because of the movie The Patriot itself, General Cornwallis, who might be one of the more truly intelligent individuals and one of the more intelligent generals that we had in this country, or world history, is going to be dispatched in this war. But the first general that will arrive to the United States that will fight for the British is a man named General Thomas Gage. He will arrive in New England, in Boston, in May of 1774, and he is the de facto military leader, the military governor, for the most part. His job there is to basically get rid of the rebels. They will basically find all the gunpowder, all the supplies, all the weapons. They will track down the rebels, break through the doors if they have to. They will restore law and order at any necessary capabilities in any way that they can possibly. What's tough is that, once you start doing things in a particular way, men of capability and power and, just intelligence, these smart men, these rebels, the Sons of Liberty themselves, they adapt, they are capable, and ultimately leads to the formation of many local rebel militias that basically are able to, at a minute's notice, prepare and take away all the supplies that they need. At a minute's notice, prepare for combat and prepare for fighting. At a minute's notice, prepare to defend the rights and liberties of all the individuals. And these men will be known as Minutemen, many of whom were actually veterans of the French and Indian War, and a lot of them just young men capable of fighting and ready to fight for truly something that they couldn't hold their hats to, something to believe in: freedom. One particular instance, General Gage seized munitions in Cambridge and Charleston, but when he arrived to do the same in Salem, things were touchy. His troops were met by a large crowd of these Minutemen. A standoff ensued. One was waiting if one was going to fire a bullet at the other. Would this be the first shot heard around the world? That day, the Minutemen would stand victorious as the great British troops and empire would leave empty-handed. New Hampshire Minutemen took over Fort William and Mary and confiscated weapons and cannons there, as the Northeast, and specifically New England themselves, were readied for war. A lot of the other colonies are a little bit worried. They're a little bit scared. A lot of these colonies, some are just straight up loyalist colonies. They don't want to fight this war. But other colonies are beckoning for it. And, a lot of people are looking at Virginia in particular. Virginia is the one colony and the one state, the largest state, the most powerful state, most prosperous state, that if they join, then this war is legitimate. And there's nothing that they can do to stop it. There will be no going back. A lot of people are seeing this happen. But while the tensions are rising, New England tensions continue to rise even faster. On one day, April 19th, 1775, General Gage notices and gets word of a powder magazine that's stored in Concord, Massachusetts. He orders troops to seize these munitions and basically instructions straight from King George and London himself. Call for the rest of the rebel leaders, specifically Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Minutemen left Boston under the cover of darkness, but many of the Bostonian riders let the militias know that the British are coming. Paul Revere's famous ride. He would never finish his ride. Henry Longworth Longfellow actually just made this poem up in a lot of ways, incorporating and implying that he had made it to Concord, but he would never be able to do so. Minutemen met the British troops and skirmished with them. The battle itself was very tense. If you could actually play it out in a movie, you just imagine these British troops going to the small town itself. People are seeing what's going to happen. Imagine being there that day when the first shot is fired, and you're just a bystander watching as many Minutemen stand their ground, looking at the British troops or ordering them to give up their munitions. It's a tense standoff. Sunlight hits the sunrise hits the people's faces, and next thing you know, the shot heard around the world. First at Lexington, and then at Concord later on. The British retreated to Boston, enduring ambushes from several militias along the way. 4,000 militiamen took part in these skirmishes with British soldiers, as 7,000 British soldiers and 5,000 patriots died. 73 British soldiers and 49 patriots died during the British retreat to Boston. I'm about to say that's a lot of men to die, but I think I just need glasses now. I guess I'm getting old. It's very fascinating. Propaganda starts going on from this point on. A lot of things are being pointed out because no one knows who fired that first shot. No one knows, and to this day, no one truly knows. And I don't know myself with all my research that I've done. I cannot coherently tell you. I would probably say it might have been an American Minutemen in particular. But you know what? It could have been a British person. I don't know. The world will never know. But the shot heard around the world would be the igniting battle and the igniting moment that will start this war for independence. It is war. The Revolutionary War. One day I will talk about the Declaration of Independence, and another day I will talk about the Revolutionary War in detail specifically, but ultimately the lead up to what would become the American Revolution, and ultimately the American Revolution, which will last from 1763 to 1783. The only other couple events that I think I can truly cover without going into detail, specifically for the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War specifically, is just the significance of those two events in particular. Life works in mysterious ways, and, things tend to happen that, can almost be deemed fate. documents, for instance, a little pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine is going to come out very early in 1776 that will directly influence this country into basically moving towards a break from Great Britain, for better or worse. The war for independence will rage on for the better part, specifically 5 to 6 years, towards Washington being the leader and being the man who will push us through this myriad of troubles, times, and fighting, and just anger and frustration. We will succeed ultimately in the end, because the British cannot handle the debt. They cannot handle the level of men that they lose. They cannot handle the cost that we are costing them ultimately. The whole point for them to do all this, ironically, is just to erase a debt. I think we lose sight of this in a lot of ways, that it's little things like this that I tend to chuckle about. I guess in a lot of ways I'm going to be ending this episode roughly around here, because ultimately by the time 1783 occurs, the significance of the war itself, the fighting showing that we are capable of standing up to a tyrant, and the Declaration of Independence itself, ultimately just being the deciding factor itself of our separation of Great Britain, and ultimately what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a person, and there's going to be unfortunate realities that come with the Declaration of Independence, and that come with, the Articles of Confederation, and a whole bunch of different things, some racial issues. Let's just be honest, it was for specifically white men, although the principles and ideas that we all believed in within this country would ultimately allow us to change within this country, specifically for better or worse, and us being an example of liberty and equality for the most part. A lot of other countries had it much easier because they were able to, get rid of slavery much quicker and much easier, because their entire economies were not built around slavery like the United States was in particular. People have to understand that, it's very difficult to compare the United States to a whole bunch of different countries when, most countries basically, didn't have the same level of agriculture. They couldn't keep slaves and finance slaves in the same way that they could, like in the United States. So I just want to point that out real quick, just to, talk about American independence, ultimately, and the American Revolution. This is a very tumultuous time, this entire war itself, ultimately, and this entire conflict, but, this is about change. This is about ideas, and ultimately, the entire war itself and the Declaration of Independence ultimately end up being the biggest things ultimately that end up fulfilling the promise of our ability to create a new nation of basically Enlightenment ideals. This idea of rationalism, this idea that, we are human beings, that we are flawed people, and that we, may struggle to govern ourselves properly. We will fall into the trap and the hellhole that are many other countries, and notably the ones that we believe are some of the greatest, have fallen. Rome wasn't built in a day, but Rome, would fall one day. The Greeks may have had some of the greatest, people, Philip the Great and Alexander the Great, and every single great philosopher you can think of, from Aristotle and every other individuals, Pericles. A whole bunch of different individuals, ideas of rational thought and theory. They themselves would fail too. In this idea of a republicanism, and the way that we think about it today really begins here. The Treaty of Paris will be signed in 1783, in which the details are going to be favoring the United States in a lot of ways, and you have to understand, Great Britain, I think in a lot of ways, realized that they were wrong. And I point this out. You have to understand, I think we take it for granted today, but, you have to understand empathetically, the difference back then to today. We can't rationalize a lot of the things back then. imagine having to wait, a month and a half for a boat to cross the entire continent and the entire ocean, for the most part, to go to horseback just to drop off a letter to the king. 8 pages that you have to specifically detail every single demand, every single little thing that you possibly can humanly write and humanly say. Over time, that's going to say everything that you want. Today we basically can just send a text message from halfway across the country, just say, "Hey, what's up?" Okay. A single letter. And, it's fascinating how, I think if we lived in a different time, different things will occur. Just imagine if the news media was here today, hypothetically speaking, and let's say also hypothetically unbiased, but, that's never going to be true. If they were back then today, and, King George could actually see what was happening, their anger, their frustration in front of them, would he have acted differently? Probably. Who knows? When we, and I'm an American, and, you learn American history, you learn about the American Revolution, you learn about it hundreds of times. So if I think, it loses its luster when you learn about it for the 5th time, in high school, and it's kind of just, I already know all the things that I have to know about the American Revolution. Why do I need to keep learning about it again? And, it loses its luster. And it loses its meaning and its importance over time. And certain subjects, I think, do the exact same thing when it's beaten into our heads over and over and over again. But it doesn't mean that it's not important. There's various reasons why we learn certain subjects in history. Ever since the end of World War II, the world wars tend to be more emphasized. The Civil War tends to be really aggressively emphasized because of its, sheer importance. If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. But, the American Revolution kind of just goes all over the place because of, reasons, and ultimately because of its significance and its importance. Ultimately is the biggest reason why. We always talk about it. Because you have to understand, after the American Revolution, the world is different. Immediately after, many other people decide they're gonna, and go up and do their own revolutions, their own rebellions. France is going to be the next big one, and although they take it in a very different direction, it's directly influenced by the likes of the American Revolution. Declaration of the Rights of Man is basically just a Declaration of Independence, just, the French version. So it's a Declaration of Independence with a baguette, and little things like that. Haiti is going to be next in line too, with the Laveur Toussaint, who's going to be leading the slave uprising, who's going to, and Hamilton's actually going to recognize Haiti, and it's just little things like that. But liberalism and democracy, and just a general idea of, hey, we probably don't need a king or an autocracy anymore, and it's going to start really fucking up Europe, and really aggressively so. In the 1820s, 1830s, when it's shown that, Andrew Jackson, for instance, is going to be a pretty strong president, and a lot of these other countries are just going to be like, oh, republicanism actually can kind of work, all these checks and balances, and, European nations are going to basically kind of lose control for a time being. And because of this American Revolution, it influences everything. Everything that's happened is really because, in a lot of ways, of the American Revolution. When Otto von Bismarck comes in and he's resisting, I guess you could say, the takedown of the monarchy and the aristocracy and yada yada, and England really strangleholding their power for the monarchy during the era of Queen Victoria, although they will eventually start losing their power to the Parliament soon. Napoleon III is going to rise up from basically another small French Revolution, and a whole bunch of other different countries, specifically in Europe, are going to really be feeling the effects of this. And, the world's never going to be the same, because you have to understand, historically speaking, that there's been thousands and thousands of years of, kings, queens, rulers and, heredity family lines that have, basically kind of kept us in the Stone Age, for better or worse. And, you live and died by your king, but now you don't. In America, you just have to wait 4 years. And it's no surprise that, America, the ideas of the Enlightenment, that coincides with, this idea of exceptionalism, capability, that, within 250 years, we're at the point that we're at now in this modern age, And I'm not saying it's directly because of the American Revolution, but, it's hard to really think of anything else when one thinks about, all the progress we've made, and it just stems from ideas. This country isn't built on national identity. It's technically and specifically functionally built on ideas, more so above all else: freedom, democracy, liberty, etc., etc. And ultimately that the poor do not have to deal with the rich, or in a specific way, like the minority rule. The minorities and the minority people and minority groups do not have to be subjected to the realities of the majority. Ultimately, checks and balances, equality throughout in a lot of ways. The American Revolution is one of the single greatest, I guess you could say, moments, a blink of an eye within history, and ultimately deserves its place within the echelon of great historical moments throughout the world. And cannot forget all the great things that came from it. Don't tread on me, the great individuals and people who would fight in the Revolutionary War, who would fight for freedom. Mel Gibson and Mel Gibson, the Patriot, and all the great historical figures that come along with it. Men like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, George Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, all these people who would be a part of this great experimenting in this specific revolution shall not be forgotten. Thank you guys for listening to this episode. I feel like listen, if you don't, you guys can eat biscuits and have a great day, gal.